The Supreme Court has just delivered a decision that will shape America's trade policy and presidential power for years. This wasn't just about tariffs, it was a test of who controls America's economic destiny, Congress or the president. At issue, did President Trump have the authority to impose sweeping tariffs on nearly every country by declaring a national emergency? The stakes were enormous, impacting businesses, consumers, and America's global relationships. The justices had to decide if a 1977 law, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act (IEEPA), gave the president the power to bypass Congress on trade. Their ruling would either cement a dramatic expansion of executive authority or restore Congress's traditional role in setting trade policy. The Trump administration's tariffs were unprecedented in both scale and rationale. These measures were not just about economics, they were deeply intertwined with national security concerns. In 2025, two major sets of tariffs were announced: the worldwide tariffs, a baseline 10% on nearly all imports, and the trafficking tariffs targeting Canada, China, and Mexico. These tariffs were designed to pressure these countries into stricter enforcement of anti-trafficking laws. The administration claimed these were necessary to address trade deficits and combat drug trafficking and illegal immigration. The rationale was that economic pressure would lead to better cooperation from these nations. The legal basis? IEPA, a law meant for targeted sanctions, not sweeping trade taxes. Critics argued this was a misuse of the law. Trump declared national emergencies to justify these moves, arguing economic threats and border crises required immediate action. This declaration allowed him to bypass the usual checks and balances. These tariffs bypassed Congress, upending decades of trade negotiation and sparking a constitutional showdown. The move was seen as an overreach of executive power. Businesses and states quickly challenged the president's authority, arguing he was inventing new powers for himself. Legal experts debated the implications of such a precedent. The stage was set for a historic legal battle over the limits of presidential power. The outcome would have lasting impacts on the balance of power in the U.S. government. The Supreme Court found itself at the center of a heated legal battle, hearing two starkly different arguments that would test the very limits of presidential authority. The courtroom was tense, as justices listened intently to both sides, aware that their decision could have far-reaching consequences for the separation of powers in the United States. The Trump administration argued forcefully that the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEPA, gave the president sweeping discretion to act in times of crisis, even if that meant imposing tariffs on foreign goods. They claimed that in an unpredictable world, the president needed the flexibility to respond quickly to threats, and that Congress had intentionally granted this broad authority. Administration lawyers pointed out that if Congress disagreed with the president's actions, it could always amend or repeal the law. Yet, Congress had not done so, suggesting tacit approval of the president's emergency powers. On the other side, a coalition of states and business groups pushed back. They argued that the Constitution gives Congress, not the president, the exclusive power to set tariffs and regulate trade. IEPA, they insisted, was never intended to serve as a backdoor for sweeping trade taxes or to bypass the legislative process. These challengers warned that allowing the president to declare emergencies and impose taxes at will would effectively erase Congress's constitutional role in economic policy, undermining the checks and balances that define American democracy. They emphasized that historically, IEPA had only been used for targeted sanctions against specific threats, never as a tool to rewrite the nation's entire trade policy or to levy broad tariffs. At its core, the case boiled down to a fundamental question: can the president unilaterally reshape the American economy under the guise of an emergency, or does Congress alone hold the power of the purse and the authority to set trade policy? The Supreme Court's answer would not only resolve this immediate dispute, but also define the balance of power between the branches of government for generations to come. Before reaching the Supreme Court, the case moved through the lower courts. The Court of International Trade ruled against the administration, saying IEPA didn't authorize such sweeping tariffs. The Federal Circuit upheld this, emphasizing that Congress, not the president, controls taxes and trade. Judges said if Congress wanted to give away such power, it would have done so explicitly. The courts called the tariffs a massive new tax scheme, not a regulation of trade. Recognizing the stakes, they allowed the tariffs to remain, while the case went to the Supreme Court. These rulings set a strong precedent. Presidential emergency powers have limits. The stage was set for the Supreme Court's final word. The Supreme Court delivered a landmark rebuke to executive overreach. In a 6-3 decision, the court ruled IEPA does not let the president impose broad, unilateral tariffs as economic policy. The majority said Congress alone has the power to tax and regulate foreign commerce. The court found IEPA's silence on tariffs was intentional. Taxing is a distinct power, not to be assumed. The decision immediately ended the worldwide and trafficking tariffs, providing relief to businesses and consumers. The ruling set a clear precedent. Emergency powers can't be used to bypass Congress on trade. The verdict reaffirmed checks and balances, pushing back against decades of growing executive power. If future presidents want sweeping trade changes, they must go through Congress. The Supreme Court's decision will ripple through the economy and global markets, sending shockwaves far beyond the marble steps of Washington, D.C. This isn't just a legal ruling, it's a turning point that will touch the lives of everyday people, businesses, and governments around the world. For American consumers, the impact will be felt at the checkout counter. Prices on imported goods, everything from electronics to clothing and groceries, are expected to fall, easing the pressure of inflation and giving families a bit more breathing room in their budgets. With lower costs, purchasing power rises, and households may find it easier to afford the things they need and want. For businesses, especially those that rely on global supply chains, the ruling brings a welcome sense of stability. No longer will they face unpredictable tariff costs or sudden disruptions that can throw off planning and investment. This clarity allows companies to focus on growth, innovation, and hiring, rather than scrambling to adapt to shifting trade barriers. Small and medium-sized companies, which often lack the resources to navigate complex trade rules, stand to benefit the most. With a more predictable environment, these businesses can plan for the future, expand their operations, and compete more effectively both at home and abroad. Globally, major trading partners like China, the EU, Japan, and India are watching closely. For them, the ruling is a chance to reset strained relationships, open new channels for negotiation, and perhaps bring an end to the cycle of tit-for-tat trade wars that have dominated headlines in recent years. For India, the removal of high tariffs on steel and aluminum is a significant relief. Indian manufacturers can now compete more fairly in the U.S. market, potentially boosting exports and supporting jobs in key industries. However, it's important to remember that this decision doesn't spell the end of protectionism. It simply closes one avenue for imposing tariffs, while others may still be available to policymakers seeking to shield domestic industries. The world is watching closely. Will the administration now work with Congress to craft new trade policies, or will it look for alternative ways to impose tariffs and protect American interests? The next steps are uncertain and the stakes are high. While the legal battle may be over, the underlying political and economic tensions remain unresolved. Markets, businesses, and governments are all bracing for what comes next. The next moves, by lawmakers, business leaders, and global partners, will determine whether this moment marks a true turning point in global trade, or simply a brief pause in a much longer contest. Even before the Supreme Court's decision, the Trump administration was preparing a new strategy. The White House turned to Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act, which lets the president impose tariffs on imports deemed national security threats. This law is broader and harder for courts to challenge. The administration had already used it for steep tariffs on steel, aluminum, and copper. Now it's investigating new targets: pharmaceuticals, semiconductors, trucks, timber, aircraft, and wind turbines. For India, this is especially concerning as its pharmaceutical exports could be hit hard. Section 232 allows the administration to keep pressuring trade partners even after the IEEPA defeat. The global trading system now faces a new, unpredictable challenge, one that may prove even harder to stop.